In 2015, the Paris Agreement set out a target of reducing global warming by 2050 to 1.5 degrees. In order to do this, some drastic steps need to be made. Yes, renewables such as wind farms and geothermal energy are effective, but the removal of anthropogenic, that is human-related CO2, from the atmosphere is crucial to achieve these targets. CO2 is being deployed currently in the US, Europe, Australia, Canada and the Middle East, but to reach these targets, current storage amounts in the millions of tonnes, so roughly 40 million tonnes of CO2 annually, needs to be increased to the billion tonne scale, that is gigatons. It's estimated that about 10 gigatons of CO2 is needed to be stored in rocks underground to reach that Paris Agreement target. That's the equivalent of every human on Earth, so about 8 billion of us, carrying 1.25 tonnes of CO2 on our shoulders. But what is CO2? What are the principles and how is it done? Find out in this mini episode of The Core of Everything. The high concentration of CO2 emissions from industrial areas and fossil fuel power production processes can be compressed and then transported via pipelines and injected directly into porous sedimentary rocks underground. It is possible to directly transport CO2 from its source into the rocks. At atmospheric pressure, CO2 is a gas, which has a much lower density than rocks and water. But due to this low density, it makes it much harder to store underground without it just leaking to the surface. But under a pressure of about 5 times our atmosphere, CO2 becomes a liquid. So luckily, as you go deep into the earth, pressure starts to build. And at about a depth of 800 meters to a kilometer, CO2 reaches a supercritical fluid state, making it far easier to store due to a lower density disparity between the CO2 and the surrounding rock. Now, rocks soak up CO2 like a sponge, and like a sponge, rocks are filled with holes, known as pore spaces, where the CO2 can be trapped. These rocks are called reservoir rocks. Now, although the CO2 is liquid, it's still far less dense than the surrounding rock and starts to rise. Therefore, above a reservoir rock, we need a seal to stop it escaping to the surface. This is usually an impermeable rock, such as a shale and mudstone, which is acting like a lid above the reservoir rock. Now, either the rocks are then folded in such a way that CO2 is trapped in a pocket beneath the seal, or they're cracked or faulted such that an impermeable rock is moved above a permeable rock, so it might require some kind of deformation. Now, the juxtaposition of an impermeable and permeable rock forms something called a structural trap, which holds the CO2 inside a physical barrier, preventing it from migrating upwards. Well, there are multiple ways in which the interactions between the rocks and CO2 and water help the CO2 trapped within that rock. There's residual trapping, so the CO2 is trapped in pore spaces as small droplets that are immobilized by capillary forces. So water, or liquid CO2, is kind of sticky due to cohesion, which is when water molecules stay close together, and adhesion is where water molecules are attracted to and stick to other substances. So when the CO2 is passing through a rock, small amounts become disconnected and trapped within these pore spaces. Now, we also have dissolution trapping, where CO2 dissolves into the surrounding brine or water like sugar in a cup of tea, which massively reduces the risk of leakage as it becomes part of the liquid. Now, CO2 can be dissolved before being directed into the rock, which also reduces the risk of leakage during injection. But importantly, CO2, when mixed with water, becomes an acid, a weak acid known as carbonic acid, HCO3-, otherwise known as acid rain. And this reacts with the surrounding rock to form solid minerals, which leads us to mineral trapping. Solid rock is an amalgamation of minerals, each consisting of different elements. So rocks like basalts are rich in positive cations, like ferrous iron, so Fe2+, magnesium, Mg2+, and calcium, Ca2+. As carbonic acid is negatively charged, the positive and negative ions are attracted like two ends of a magnet. They bind and form their own minerals like siderite, magnesite, and calcium carbonate. Essentially, you're creating more rock in the small pore spaces in the original rock, and this has the potential to trap CO2 for millions of years. Sedimentary rocks like sandstones and limestones produce wonderful reservoirs for CO2, water, and oil and gas. Carbonate rocks like limestones are rich in calcium, which can react with CO2 to form stable carbonate minerals like calcite, but most global CO2 storage projects involve sandstone. The world's largest and first CO2 storage project is the Sleipner project in Norway, which is located in the North Sea, and CO2 is being directly captured from natural gas production and pumped into sandstones under the sea. A similar project is also happening in Australia, known as the Gorgon project in deep sandstones. But the applicability of sandstone and existing infrastructure and geological knowledge of areas means it's common to repurpose old, mature oil and gas fields for CO2 storage. Now, the injection of CO2 into depleted oil and gas reservoirs is referred to as enhanced oil recovery. It both residually traps CO2 in the pore spaces and reduces the oil viscosity, making it flow towards wells and improving the ease of extraction. Now, it seems contradictory, at least, to say to inject CO2 is only to improve the output of fossil fuels. But the idea is that the CO2 released from the newly extracted oil does not outweigh the amount of CO2 injected. And this is currently being used in New Mexico in the USA, Alberta, Canada, and Saudi Arabia, and it's being explored in areas in the UK and Norway. Another rock which is creating a lot of excitement at the moment, for CO2 storage at least, is basalt. Now, basalt is an igneous rock. It's preserved ancient lava flows. Now, lava flows stack on top of each other, and you can look at examples of this in Iceland and Hawaii. Now, as lava extruded onto the surface, gas is trying to escape. It forms small gas bubbles as the lava solidifies into rock, which produces a series of holes. And this is referred to as vesicular basalt and forms the pore spaces we need to store CO2. Importantly, each basalt flow seals the one below. So the vesicular basalt is sealed by the overlying flow. Basalt is also highly reactive with the CO2 due to the huge enrichment in iron and magnesium. This means that CO2 is trapped quickly and potentially for millions of years. Iceland is a chief potential area for this, as well as areas in the US, including off the east coast, which is currently being explored. Using these rock principles, it's been estimated that there are rocks around the world suitable enough for 10,000 to 30,000 gigatons of CO2 storage, 30,000 billion tons of CO2 storage. This is at suitable depths and geology, although it doesn't necessarily consider legal obstructions. So leakage. So with regards to enhanced oil recovery, there's existing infrastructure from old oil and gas days that may be weak spots for leakage, so the CO2 can escape up. But there are many targets around the world that have identified guaranteed leakage rates of less than 0.01%. And this is mainly for highly reactive rocks where mineral trapping, so the formation of more rock, is favoured. And then we have seismicity. So the increased fluid pressure in faults and cracks may lead to a release of elastic strain energy, or an earthquake, which is a typical problem with something like fracking. But luckily, ductile rocks, so these are rocks that can be bent under pressure, so they bend rather than break, they can accommodate substantial deformation and the faults behave aseismically. So instead of snapping like a ruler to produce an earthquake, they bend like a curly-whirly or a cheese string or Slim Jim if you're American. And one way to settle any nerves is to say that fluids like oil and gas have remained stable in these rocks for millions of years. Therefore, you could argue there is no reason CO2 wouldn't behave in a similar way. Importantly, a paper by Crever et al. 2023 established that CO2 storage scale-up to gigatons is not limited by geological or engineering constraints, but by public awareness and acceptance. There's an ever-growing support for CO2 storage in the USA, Canada and Norway, and they concluded that the policies and strength of support for CO2 storage in these countries should be considered by other governments interested in scaling up CO2 storage. The geological principles show the immense possibility of CO2 storage to reduce the anthropogenic CO2 emissions. One key roadblock is the huge cost in removing CO2 directly from the atmosphere. The next few decades are crucial in identifying if CO2 capture and storage will become economically feasible and a major player in our fight against global warming.